Hi, welcome to my presentation today. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person or live, but I hope this video recording suffices. And if you do have any questions or comments, please do email me. My email's at the end of this presentation and the slides. So yeah, just to jump straight into it, because I know we've got limited time. So I'll give you a brief overview of my research content. So the question is, what levers can be used to incentivize AI developers to prioritize AI safety? Next slide, please. So the research, as you can see from my abstract, assesses the competitive dynamic between OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, DeepMind, and Meta in their competition to deploy generative AI systems. The analysis seeks to identify and understand the key levers that may incentivize or propel these companies to prioritize fast system deployment over AI safety. So this will allow policymakers, regulators, and other stakeholders, it's hoped to focus on where to adapt or control these same levers in a reverse manner, and instead incentivizes AI safety. Next slide. So the methodology here. So the research includes an analysis of these labs' corporate structures and their relevant stakeholders, chronological assessment of levers that are underlying competitive behavior, and also, importantly, interviews with policy employees at these companies. And as you can see, this is my theory of change, which you can see. But firstly, to talk about the status of my research, which I'll split into two separate parts of this presentation. So firstly, the current research question, which I just described, is not at a conclusive stage right now, since the interview process, which is really the most important aspect of concretizing answers here, is still ongoing. So I thought instead of presenting all the intricacies and question marks I still have and like hypotheses, it's probably more interesting to sort of present to you some more of the core lessons that I've learned so far from the data that I've gathered. And secondly, I've also produced another offshoot piece of research arising from this, asking how we evaluate the legal structures of the top AI companies and how they work in effectively aligning incentives for, like, say, profit and also AI safety, and how they prioritize AI safety within them. So I'll therefore discuss some of those key takeaways from that part of the research. Next slide. So lessons learned. So the first lesson, the existence of paradoxes and uncertainty underlying corporate strategy. So for AI labs, competitive strategy is not dichotomized between seemingly opposing strategies, and there's also a level of malleability within labs as to their approach, where AI safety and commercial advantage may come into conflict. So I've seen this across several instances, firstly in the closed versus open source debate and the differing stances on that between these companies. Secondly, this can also be seen in an attitude towards fostering wider competitive market as opposed to retaining a level of oligopoly. So here there's a concern for labs where a lot of smaller players entering the market, and diversification could be a problem regarding AI safety standards dropping, and thus there's an incentive to create moats or limit wider market competition. But also these labs are conscious of the fact that an oligopoly that restricts market competition in the long term is not good. At least certain labs think that. Thirdly, we've seen the changing financial structures of these labs and the trade-offs that have been happening at the moment, particularly with, say, Anthropic and OpenAI that have taken on big tech investors, Microsoft and Google. So ultimately, the fundamental stances of AI labs on these strategy points appear to be poised to change and are in flux. So strategy is not a single, like fixed to a single ethos in these labs, but is importantly malleable. Next slide, please. So lesson 2, getting research interviews from employees at AA labs is not the easiest. And there's a whole lot of sort of practical things that are going on here, but also what can this sort of indicate about the wider industry? Perhaps that the industry is not as open or conducive to researchers or academics as it could be, and definitely points towards the culture of secrecy that maybe is exaggerated, but also there's probably an element of competitive secrecy there, and a general lack of transparency around what's going on behind the corporate doors of these AI companies. Next slide. So lesson 3, epistemological walls can still be informative. So I've learned that when trying to understand the motivations and decision-making drivers of these labs, there are epistemological walls that can't necessarily be surpassed, but and you know, this is not unlike any other competitive industry, but there are learnings here. So one example is Dario Amadei's statements in response to Senator Josh Hawley at the US Senate subcommittee hearing on the oversight of AI. So when pressed as to whether Anthropic had any plans to integrate Claude with Google models, such as through Google Search, Dario Amadei would not say whether the company had plans to do so in the future, only that they currently were not doing so. So there's definitely a knowledge barrier for us there, but this does, however, tell us something in of itself. So there's not a no to them doing this with Google in future, with this kind of refusal to either affirm or deny the question. Next slide, please. So lesson 4, understanding how these companies operate, both in terms of their stakeholders and corporate structures, is key to understanding how incentive structures do or don't work for them. So for example, Google, which ultimately is obligated to maximize returns for shareholders, for them, profitability will always be a fundamental incentive. However, for OpenAI, that has a capped for-profit model, it's eliminated the fiduciary duty to generate profit for its shareholders in its operating agreement. So it's not to say profitability isn't important for these companies or for OpenAI, which I'll talk about a bit later, but there's definitely less legal pressure on them to do so. So there's these integral differences. Next slide. And then lesson 5, so the importance of flexibility. So there are 2 instances where flexibility became important in the research process. So firstly, in terms of reevaluating certain assumptions about upon which the research question is based, and being able to incorporate unexpected events from such a fast-paced industry. So one of these was the announcement of the Frontier Model Forum, and this kind of tested the underlying assumption of competitiveness between the AI developers involved, as it was an indicator of prioritizing collaboration and standard setting with AI safety, as opposed to like very aggressive competition. Then how does this operate in the competitive dynamic, which still obviously exists, but I thought was perhaps creating more institutionalized forum of industry norms and standards. This could allow the founding AI labs of the forum to position themselves competitively against companies such as Meta as more responsible product providers, i.e. lean into establishing an AI safety race as a commercial or competitive strategy that suits their business models, or leverage greater influence over regulation and legislators than their counterparts, which we've seen definitely with the US government and their greater sympathies towards OpenAI as opposed to Meta, for example. But this obviously needs a lot more confirmation from interviews and greater extrapolation. Next slide. So I'll talk more about the case study I've been working on as well. So this case study examines the legal corporate structures of OpenAI and Anthropic. Both labs are exercising a form of self-governance in leveraging their corporate structures to codify AI safety and responsibility into their governance and operations, whilst also enabling sufficient financing, which is key. Next slide. So Anthropic is a Delaware public benefit corporation, which largely acts like a general corporation legally, but has some key differentiating features. Next slide. And then OpenAI, which was originally just a nonprofit entity, now has a fairly complex structure, as you can see, with a capped for-profit subsidiary. So the question is how we evaluate OpenAI and Anthropic's corporate structures as useful levers to hold them accountable for prioritizing AI safety. So some of my key takeaways from this short paper. Next slide. So the fiduciary duties. So in these companies, there has been a limitation or removal of traditional directors' fiduciary duties towards shareholders to maximize financial returns. And this adds a level of legal protection for directors against shareholders who may pursue directors and pressurize them to, for example, deploy a product that could see great commercial returns, but may not be ready safety-wise, or the developers aren't comfortable about deploying it. However, there are some gaps and grey areas as to how directors would be held accountable legally for a positive duty towards their public interest aims instead. So currently in Anthropic, a failure by a director to sufficiently consider the public benefit interest of responsible AI development in their decision-making process so they can't really be held accountable for such a failure without shareholders bringing a derivative action against directors, where shareholders have their own financial conflict of interest. So it's wholly reliant on the shareholders to pursue that avenue of accountability. Next slide. And then the role of profit incentives. So OpenAI's structure seeks to limit the role of profit as a factor interfering with decisions impacting the development of AI in a safe manner. However, profit is still very much playing an important role. So OpenAI's for-profit entity has capped returns for their investors beyond a certain amount and based upon their initial investment amount. So this is a step in the right direction, but this profit cap is discretionary and subject to negotiation with investors who have a lot of leveraging power and also are at the moment, at least from the last cap that we saw with OpenAI, there's still a lot of room for very significant returns for investors. Also, pressure from investors deriving from indirect financial value that they may derive, that may arise from commercial agreements, is not accounted for by OpenAI in their legal structure in a similar way. So things such as licensing, etc. Next slide. And then flexibility. So fundamentally, these companies' legal structures are designed to be flexible and keep metamorphosing their structure according to arising competitive shifts and demands in the industry. So in effect, this could undermine the legal bindingness of the elements of these structures which do serve to preserve AI safety. So yeah. Next slide. And yeah, so that's a very brief overview of my research, and there's definitely a huge amount more that I could say about it and go into greater detail. But for now, I hope that gives you some idea, and please do ask questions. But to finish, I'd like to say thank you to, firstly, the ERA Fellowship Program and everyone on the team, Rethink Priorities, my mentors, so Claire, Jessica, and Moritz. Very, very grateful for all the help and support, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the process. So thank you very much.